I'd like to thank you for taking the time to have this meeting with me on behalf of Kurd Kanal, also known as Kurd Channel. It is important to our communities that our members of Parliament acknowledge our concerns and give us the time to share our views. Now, Amy, you are a member of the Legislative Assembly of Queensland representing the Greens for the seat of South Brisbane since 2020. From what I have read, you are not scared to take a strong stance for what is right and for what you believe in, especially being a woman. I can definitely appreciate how challenging that can be. In saying that, are you across the global woman life freedom movement that took place on the 16th of September, sparked by the death of the young Kurdish woman Jina Amini in Iran?
Yeah, so I've been following this, and I've been privileged to be involved with a rally that happened a couple of months ago for the 1-year anniversary of Jina Amini's death, and got to speak with the Iranian, Kurdish and broader diaspora community here in Brisbane about Jina Amini's death and the revolution that her death sparked since then, and reflecting on the treatment of women in Iran and other parts of the world that this revolution is responding to.
As a year has now passed, what are your thoughts on the systematic oppression and high number of death tolls caused by the Iranian government during this uprising?
Yeah, look, I think this is just appalling and really deserves global condemnation. Protest shouldn't be condemned with violence, and people should be allowed to have the opportunity to express their opinions and also to push for political change. You know, what tools do we have available to us to change governments, to change policy, to change the societies that we live in without big movements of people? And when that is responded to with violence, with horrific violence, you know, that's sort of oppression on a mass scale. And I think we're seeing that on the ground in Iran in the last year and the decades prior to that, when, you know, it has been very difficult for people to be able to express themselves and to have a meaningful role in the political process. And protest is part of our political protest, part of our political system. It's part of how we make change. And I think, you know, that the repression from the government in Iran should be condemned by governments right around the world, and certainly condemned by any communities who care about human rights.
Women are the forefront of the women life freedom movement, in which we also call Xinjiang Azadi in Kurdish. What are your thoughts on women leading this protest?
Yeah, look, I think this is really powerful, and I think this particular movement is responding in part to the terrible oppression that women have faced in Iran for many decades. You know, restrictions around what they wear, access to employment, education, reproductive and other healthcare rights. And so it makes sense that women would be at the forefront of a movement that is fighting for women's rights, and a movement that is kind of guided in some way by feminist principles. I think this movement is also responding to broader societal issues that people on the ground are facing. You know, as with many other countries, people facing, you know, very precarious economic conditions, and these are the kinds of conditions under which, you know, people feel that they need a say, and they want a government that's actually going to respond to their needs. But I think having women at the forefront of this movement is part of what makes it so powerful. You know, it's quite unique in having a movement that is specifically centred around women and has women at the forefront, as women have always been. You know, if you look at any movement anywhere, women are always on the front lines they might not be recognised as such, but women are always at the forefront of any of these movements for change. But I think having a movement that specifically recognises the role that women play in these kind of revolutionary moments, and the role that women play in creating change is really powerful.
Why do you think the Islamic Republic of Iran tried to suppress the uprising with such violent intensity?
I think, you know, when you have sort of violence as kind of a norm in terms of how you deal with populations, how you deal with any kind of political unrest, the bigger the movement, the more forceful that violence is going to be in the other direction. And when you don't have when people don't have opportunities to, you know, express themselves in different ways, any kind of expression is going to be met with violence. And, you know, I think this is part of a long history of the government in Iran, you know, suppressing uprisings in violent ways. And, you know, we've seen that over the last year. And when they don't really have any other tools for dealing with the kinds of issues that people are bringing up, when they really aren't capable of the kind of reforms that are needed, the kind of changes to the economic system that are needed, and they're just desperately trying to hold on to power, this is the response. And this isn't unique to Iran. This is happening in lots of places right around the world, where governments really don't know how to respond to the kinds of you know, demands that people on the ground are making, and instead just responding with violence. And you know, to a much lesser extent here in Australia, we are seeing protest systemically curtailed, more and more restrictions around people's ability to protest, and more kind of violent responses from the police. And of course, what we've seen in Iran in the last 12 months has been extreme, and, you know, nothing like what we would see here in Australia. But I think a lot of governments are struggling to respond to these big crises that we have in front of us, and really the only tool they have available to them is violence. And, you know, in those situations, again, that's where condemnation from governments right around the world is needed, and, you know, giving power back to people on the ground to have a democratic say in what happens in their societies.
Do you believe that this Women Life Freedom movement has had an impact globally, and why?
Yeah, absolutely. You would struggle to find, you know, sort of women involved in politics here in Australia who wouldn't be aware of the Women Life Freedom movement, who haven't been to a rally, who haven't, you know, been reading online about what's been going on there. And I think this gives a kind of inspiration and hope to women all around the world, who can see this kind of you know, this shared struggle for women's rights, for dignity, for human rights. I think you know, it's definitely having an impact in the people that I speak to. A lot of people are following what's going on the ground with horror, and looking for opportunities to support people on the ground, and to support you know, members of the Iranian diaspora around the world.
Do you also believe that the movement has affected the Middle East?
Yeah, I wouldn't be able to say in detail what's going on, not being on the ground in the Middle East, but I can't imagine that this isn't having an impact on women and human rights movements in other countries. I'm sure there are women on the ground in Afghanistan, for example, who are looking at this movement for inspiration, and seeing, you know, feeling a sense of solidarity and hope when you see that there's these other movements going on, and that people are finding opportunities to express themselves. So, you know, I'm sure this is having ripple effects in other parts of the Middle East.
What are some ways in which democratic countries can show their support towards the Women Life Freedom movement? Yeah,
I know here in Australia, the Iranian Kurdish communities have some very specific demands for what they think the Australian government should be doing to respond to this very repressive regime. Have been calling for sanctions, have been calling for terrorist listing of the IRGC, and making sure that there's appeals being made to ambassadors and governments, and using those diplomatic pathways to call for an end to the violence as well. So I think there's a lot that could be happening at the kind of government level, as well as just signalling support to the diaspora community here in Australia to say you're safe. If you're taking part in rallies, you're safe to do that, and that we support your calls and your struggle here in Australia. And I think governments at all different levels could be doing that.
Do you believe our government can do more to help stop the violent acts?
Our government is in the Australian government.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I know that the Iranian Kurdish communities have been calling on the Australian government to take some of these clear steps to declare the IRGC a terrorist organisation, to put sanctions in place, to clearly express to the Iranian regime that country and other governments like them will face consequences from the international community if they don't stop the violence that's going on. So I definitely think the Australian government could be doing more.
What steps should the Australian government take to contain the Islamic regime inside and outside of Australia?
It's a really good question. I mean, there's lots of diplomatic pathways that the Australian government could be taking. As I've mentioned, very targeted sanctions against specific people linked to their regime, making sure that they're talking to the ambassadors and using those diplomatic channels to express Australia's disgust and our call to uphold human rights, and then declaring the IRGC a terrorist organisation, which the Australian government could be doing. That would have an impact on sort of curtailing the regime internally. But I think the other really important thing is supporting these movements on the ground that have been calling for regime change, which I think is also one of the kind of unique things about this particular movement, that it's not just calling for human rights and women's rights, but calling for regime change as well. And that is only going to come from the ground internally. There's a lot that we can be doing from outside, but that kind of change can only come from communities on the ground. So I think finding ways to support groups that are organising on the ground, building those networks of solidarity with other movements, with other human rights movements, with other countries that are going through similar kinds of struggles. And I think that supporting groups that are calling for democracy, that will be one of the most powerful ways, I think, to kind of affect the change that's actually needed.
Amy, thank you for your time today. As a representative of the Kurdish community, we appreciate members such as yourself who are not afraid to answer the hard questions and meet with us. I appreciate your perception on the Xinjiang Azadi movement. It's not often that we get to hear our members let us know their opinions and what they think in regards to this movement. But I do appreciate your time today, and I do appreciate everything that you have done so far.
Yeah, this is a real pleasure to be part of this. And I think just as a closing note, I think one of the really important things to remember is that this movement has been led by Kurdish women as well, and that Jinnah Amini herself was a Kurdish woman, and we can't forget that. And that the call of women life freedom isn't new. That is something that that Kurdish movements have been saying for decades, and I think remembering that long history and remembering the incredible work of Kurdish women who have been, pushing for change in many different countries for many years is really important.
Thank you so much for your time, Amy. I appreciate it.
Thank you.